It is a Sunday morning, July the 11th, 1943. The bells of a small Roman Catholic church in the village of Poryk, in the Volhynian countryside of German-occupied Poland, are ringing for Mass. Families are filing in, farmers, their wives, children in their Sunday best. They kneel, they pray, and outside, surrounding the church and the village from every direction, hundreds of men, some in uniform, many in civilian clothes, carrying axes, scythes, pitchforks, and rifles, are waiting for the signal. When it comes, they don't knock on the church door, they break it down. What happened next in Poryk, and simultaneously in at least 98 other Polish settlements across Volhynia that same Sunday, was one of the most savage, coordinated massacres of the Second World War. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, known by its Ukrainian acronym UPA, aided by local Ukrainian peasants, slaughtered an estimated 10,000 Polish men, women, and children in a single day. They killed in churches during Mass, they killed in homes, they killed in fields, and the instruments were often not bullets. They were farm tools, axes, sickles, knives, saws. Dozens of churches and chapels were burned to the ground with people still inside. This day would become known as Volhynian Bloody Sunday, and it was not the beginning of the massacres. It was the crescendo between 1943 and 1945. Up to 100,000 ethnic Poles were killed by the UPA and local Ukrainian civilians across the regions of Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. Most of the victims were women and children. Poland calls it a genocide. Ukraine calls it a tragedy. And in 2026, right now, as you're watching this, Polish and Ukrainian teams are digging up bones together in western Ukraine, trying to find and rebury the dead. 83 years later, my name is Ivo Vichev, and this is the story of Wołyń, how an 83-year-old massacre became the single most explosive obstacle to the most important military alliance in Europe today. Now, this video goes places. We're talking about ethnic cleansing, national mythology, wartime geopolitics, and why a graveyard in a Ukrainian field could determine whether a country gets into the European Union. If that sounds like the kind of history that actually matters, hit subscribe and the bell right now. You're going to want to see what comes next. To understand why Ukrainians murdered their Polish neighbors in 1943, you have to understand that Volhynia was never a simple place. Volhynia is a region in the northwest of modern Ukraine, bordering Poland to the west and Belarus to the north. For centuries, it was one of those borderlands that kept changing hands. Lithuanian, then Polish, then Russian, then Polish again. By the time Poland was reborn as an independent state after World War I, Volhynia was inside its borders. But the demographics didn't match the flag. According to the 1931 Polish census, 68% of the population in Volhynia spoke Ukrainian. Only 17% spoke Polish. The rest were Yiddish speakers, Germans, Czechs, and Russians. So you had a Ukrainian majority territory governed by a Polish state. And that state, despite some genuine attempts at toleration under Józef Piłsudski, often treated its Ukrainian minority harshly. Polish colonists, known as osadnicy, were settled on Ukrainian majority land. Over 190 Orthodox churches were destroyed or converted to Roman Catholic ones as part of a polonization campaign. Ukrainian political parties were suppressed. Administrative positions were overwhelmingly reserved for ethnic Poles. The Polish police carried out collective punishment operations in Ukrainian villages. None of this justified what came later. Nothing justifies what came later. But it created a reservoir of resentment that radical nationalists would eventually weaponize. And the most radical of all was the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN. Founded in 1929 in Vienna, the OUN was a far-right, ultra-nationalist underground movement dedicated to an independent, ethnically homogeneous Ukrainian state. Its ideology was borrowed from the European fascist movements of the era, militant, authoritarian, and built around the idea that a Ukrainian nation could only exist if every non-Ukrainian was expelled or eliminated from Ukrainian soil. By the start of World War II, the OUN had roughly 20,000 active members and many more sympathizers. But it was still a fringe movement. The most popular Ukrainian political party was actually the UNDO, the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance, which supported independence but through peaceful, democratic means. What changed everything was the Soviet invasion of 1939. When Hitler and Stalin carved up Poland in September 1939, Volhynia and Eastern Galicia were swallowed by the Soviet Union and incorporated into the Ukrainian SSR. And the Soviets, with their characteristic efficiency, immediately began destroying the existing social fabric. Around 200,000 Poles were deported to Siberia. Ukrainian community leaders, the moderates, the Democrats, the people from the UNDO, were arrested, deported, or killed. The head of the UNDO, Dmytro Levitsky, was arrested and was never heard from again. This is a critical point. The Soviets didn't just occupy Volhynia. They decapitated its moderate Ukrainian leadership. The only organized Ukrainian political force that survived underground was the extremist OUN. The reasonable voices were gone. The radicals were all that remained. And look, if you're already connecting the dots here, the occupation, the radicalization, the vacuum where moderate leadership used to be, then you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. But less than 20% of you watching right now have hit that like button. It takes half a second. It tells the algorithm this video matters. Just tap it. I'll wait. Good. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviets fled eastward. The Germans rolled in. And the OUN saw its chance. Now by this point, the OUN had already split into two factions. The older, more cautious wing was led by Andriy Melnik. These were the OUN-M. The younger, more radical faction was led by Stepan Bandera, the OUN-B, the Banderites. It was the Banderites who would drive the events that followed. As the Germans advanced, OUN-B forces organized diversions behind Soviet lines, seized villages, and formed local militias. These militias immediately participated in horrific anti-Semitic pogroms. In Lviv alone, Ukrainian nationalist mobs helped murder around 6,000 Jews. On June 30th, 1941, the OUN-B proclaimed an independent Ukrainian state in Lviv. The Germans responded by arresting Bandera and about 1,500 OUN-B leaders. They hadn't authorized any independent Ukrainian state. But here's what the Germans didn't do. They didn't destroy the organization. The OUN-B went deeper underground, and it did something that would have devastating consequences. It systematically infiltrated the Ukrainian auxiliary police, the Schutzmannschaft, units that served under German command. These Ukrainian policemen, serving the Nazis, participated directly in the murder by shooting of approximately 200,000 Volhynian Jews during the Holocaust. They saw how genocide was done. They learned the mechanics of mass killing. And when, in early 1943, the OUN-B decided to turn on both the Germans and the Poles, roughly 5,000 of these police officers deserted en masse and formed the core of a new partisan army. That army was the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA. By July 1943, the UPA had around 20,000 fighters in Volhynia. Their commander was Dmytro Klyachkivsky, codename Klim Savur, and his objective was not military, it was demographic. The OUN-B's strategic calculation was cold and simple. The Germans were losing. The Soviets would return, and when the war ended, whoever physically occupied the land would control it. The Jews were already gone, annihilated in the Holocaust. The Russians and Germans were temporary. But the Poles had roots. They had villages. They had churches. And they claimed this land. In the autumn of 1942, a meeting of OUN-B military leaders made the decision. The Polish population had to be removed from Ukrainian territory. First, community leaders would be targeted. Then, anyone who resisted. In June 1943, Klyachkivsky issued the final order, a written directive calling for the general physical liquidation of the entire Polish population of Volhynia. Not expulsion, liquidation. Now, before we go further, I want to be straight with you. The next section of this video is the hardest part. It describes coordinated mass murder carried out with farm implements against women and children in churches. I'm not going to sensationalize it. I'm going to present the documented historical record as carefully as I can. But you should know what you're about to hear. The massacres in Volhynia did not begin on Bloody Sunday. They had been escalating since February 1943. On February 9th, a UPA unit disguised as Soviet partisans attacked the Polish settlement of Peroshla in Sani County, killing between 149 and 173 people. Throughout March and April, UPA forces murdered roughly 7,000 Polish civilians across the region. In Lipniki, 184 people were killed in a single night. In Brzezina, about 130. But July 11th, 1943, Bloody Sunday, was something else. It was coordinated, planned, executed simultaneously across at least 99 settlements. The UPA deliberately chose a Sunday morning because it guaranteed that the Polish population would be concentrated in one place, the church. In Kisielin, 90 were killed. In Poryk, 200. In Orzezhin, 306. In the village of Zagaye, between 260 and 350 people were murdered. The numbers are still debated because so few survived to count. In some villages, the word on the list is simply all, every single Pole, gone. The methods of killing were deliberately brutal. The UPA leadership understood that terror was a tool. If the killings were horrifying enough, the surviving Polish population would flee without needing to be hunted down one by one. Historian Timothy Snyder, Polish historian Grzegorz Motyka, and the comprehensive research of Władysław and Iwo Siemaszko have documented the patterns. Victims were hacked with axes, stabbed with pitchforks, cut with scythes and saws. Children were thrown into wells. People were locked inside buildings that were then set on fire. Churches were surrounded, and anyone who tried to escape through the doors was cut down. It was not random savagery. It was organized ethnic cleansing carried out with agricultural tools. Not all Ukrainians participated. Some Ukrainian religious leaders condemned the killings. Some Ukrainian families hid their Polish neighbors at enormous personal risk. The UPA killed Ukrainians who sheltered Poles. The rival Ukrainian nationalist factions, the OUN-M under Melnik and Taras Bulba-Borowiec's Ukrainian People's Revolutionary Army, rejected the massacres entirely. Bulba-Borowiec publicly condemned them. But the Banderite UPA had dominance on the ground, and it used that dominance ruthlessly. The Polish response was twofold. First, self-defense. in scattered settlements across Volhynia. Polish civilians organized defensive perimeters, the most famous being the fortified village of Przebraj, which at its peak sheltered around 20,000 Polish refugees and successfully repelled a major UPA attack on July 5, 1943. Przebraj cooperated with Soviet partisans, the enemy of my enemy, and held out until the Red Army arrived in 1944. Second, retaliation. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, organized a resistance force in the region, eventually forming the 27th AK Infantry Division. Polish units carried out retaliatory attacks against Ukrainian villages. Between 2,000 and 3,000 Ukrainians were killed in these reprisals in Volhynia, and another 1,000 to 2,000 in Eastern Galicia. These were real killings of real people. They happened, but the scale was asymmetric. The UPA killed roughly 100,000 Poles. Polish forces killed roughly 3,000 to 5,000 Ukrainians. This disparity is part of why the terminology debate, genocide versus tragedy, is so charged. By the spring of 1944, the Red Army swept into Volhynia, and the mass killings there largely ceased. But the OUN-B leadership, at its third Congress in August 1943, had already voted to extend the anti-Polish operation into Eastern Galicia, the region around Lviv. There, the massacres continued through 1944, killing an additional 20,000 to 25,000 Poles. By the time it was over, the demographic map of Volhynia had been permanently redrawn. The Polish population, which had lived there for centuries, was effectively gone. And if you're the kind of person who sends videos like this to a friend at 2 a.m. with the message, "You need to watch this," be that person right now. Seriously, share this video. English language YouTube has almost nothing quality on Volhynia. Most of the search results are news clips and Polish language documentaries. The only way this story reaches the English-speaking world is if you actively push it. The algorithm buries 40-minute deep dives unless people share them. You sharing it is the difference between 5,000 views and 500,000. All right, now let's talk about what happened after the killing stopped. Because spoiler, it didn't stop. Now here's what usually happens at this point in a history video. You tell the story, you wrap it up, you move on to the next war. But the story of Wołyń does not end in 1944. It doesn't end in 1945. It is still happening. And to understand why, you need to follow two threads, one about memory and one about bones. Let's start with memory. After the war, the borders of Poland were redrawn. Volhynia was now permanently inside the Soviet Ukrainian SSR. The surviving Polish population was expelled westward, and in April 1947, the new communist Polish government carried out something called Operation Vistula, Akcja Wisła, a forced deportation of roughly 150,000 Ukrainians, Rusins, Lemkos, and Boykos from southeastern Poland to formerly German territories in the north and west. The stated justification was to eliminate support for the remaining UPA insurgents operating on Polish soil. But it was collective punishment, an entire ethnic group uprooted because of the actions of an armed minority. Poland has officially condemned Operation Vistula. It remains a deep wound in Ukrainian historical memory, so both nations have a grievance. Poland remembers the massacre. Ukraine remembers the deportation. And for 40 years under communism, neither was allowed to talk about either one publicly. The Soviets suppressed any serious discussion of the Volhynia massacres. Polish communists suppressed any discussion of Operation Vistula. The wounds didn't heal, they just went underground. When Ukraine gained independence in 1991, the historical question exploded back to the surface. And this is where a man named Stepan Bandera becomes the ghost that haunts the entire relationship. Bandera himself was not in Volhynia during the massacres. He was in a German concentration camp from 1941 to 1944. He was assassinated by the KGB in Munich in 1959. But the organization he led, the OUN-B, gave the orders. The army he inspired, the UPA, carried them out. And in post-independence Ukraine, Bandera was increasingly elevated as a national hero, not for the massacres, for the struggle against the Soviet Union. The UPA fought the Soviets long after World War II ended, carrying out a guerrilla insurgency in western Ukraine into the early 1950s. For millions of Ukrainians, particularly in the West, Bandera and the UPA represent national resistance, self-sacrifice, and the fight for Ukrainian independence. In 2010, Ukraine's then-president Viktor Yushchenko posthumously awarded Bandera the title of Hero of Ukraine. That decision was later annulled, but the sentiment remained. Streets across Ukraine were renamed after Bandera. Moscow Avenue in Kyiv became Stepan Bandera Avenue. Monuments went up. By 2023, there were roughly 40 Bandera monuments across the country. For Poland, this is intolerable. From the Polish perspective, honoring Bandera is equivalent to honoring the man whose movement ordered the murder of 100,000 Polish civilians. For Ukraine, the Polish demand to de-heroize Bandera feels like an attack on national identity, especially during a war where national identity is what keeps a country fighting. This is the knot, and it's the kind of knot that doesn't get untied by politicians. It gets untied, maybe, by people who actually understand the full story, which is you, right now. Quick thing. I'm going to keep making videos exactly like this one. Stories where history reaches forward and grabs the present by the throat. The self-defense colonies of Volhynia. The Bandera question. Operation Vistula. The whole Polish-Ukrainian cycle. If that's the kind of content you're here for, subscribe now so you don't miss any of it. Alright, let's get into the present, because this is where the story gets truly wild. In February 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Poland became Ukraine's most important lifeline overnight. Polish borders opened to millions of Ukrainian refugees. Over 1.5 million Ukrainians hold valid residence permits in Poland today. Polish territory became the primary transit route for Western weapons heading into Ukraine. Poland pushed harder than almost any other European country for sanctions on Russia, for arming Ukraine, for fast-tracking Ukraine's EU membership candidacy. And for a while, the Volhynia issue faded. The urgency of the present drowned out the ghosts of the past. But the ghosts came back. By 2024, war fatigue was setting in across Europe. And in Poland, domestic politics began to weaponize Volhynia. In July 2024, Poland's Deputy Prime Minister, Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, stated publicly that Ukraine would have no chance of joining the European Union until it resolved the Volhynia issue, specifically until Ukraine recognized the massacres as genocide. Poland's parliament had already designated July 11th as a national day of remembrance for the victims of genocide committed by Ukrainian nationalists. Ukraine rejected the genocide designation and criticized the Polish commemorative law as contrary to the spirit of good neighborly relations. Then, in 2025, came Karol Nawrocki. Nawrocki is a historian by profession. Before becoming Poland's president, he ran the Institute of National Remembrance, Poland's state agency for investigating historical crimes. The Volhynia massacres were not a side issue for him. They were his institutional specialty. During his presidential campaign, he used the Volhynia issue aggressively. telling voters he would block Ukraine's path to both the EU and NATO, until Kiev made what he called an official statement of atonement for the Volhynia massacre. He won, he took office, and in August 2025, he submitted legislation to the Polish parliament that would amend Poland's criminal code to equate Banderite symbols, including the red and black flag of the UPA, with Nazi and communist emblems, making their public display a criminal offense. Ukraine's response was immediate. The foreign ministry warned of retaliatory measures. A Ukrainian diplomat said the move could provoke negative sentiments among Ukrainians. The red and black flag had become a symbol of Ukrainian resistance during the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 and the current war. Banning, it felt like Poland was criminalizing Ukrainian identity at the exact moment Russia was trying to erase it. Now zoom out and look at the absurdity of this situation. Poland is one of Ukraine's closest military allies. Poland is a critical NATO member on Ukraine's western border. Poland is one of the loudest voices in Europe calling for Russian defeat. And at the same time, Poland's president is threatening to block Ukraine from the EU unless Ukraine renounces its national heroes and calls the UPA's actions a genocide. Russia, of course, watches all of this with undisguised glee. Russian propaganda actively exploits the Volhynia issue to drive a wedge between Warsaw and Kyiv. Experts on Polish-Ukrainian relations have documented coordinated Russian disinformation campaigns designed to amplify the historical dispute. A week before the 2025 Polish presidential election, a forged letter purporting to be from Ukraine's former culture minister was circulated, falsely claiming that Ukraine had halted the exhumations. The Polish and Ukrainian governments issued a joint denial within hours, but the damage in the information space was already done. Think about that for a second. Russia is literally fabricating documents to make Poland and Ukraine fight each other over bones from 1943. That is how strategically valuable this historical wound is. It's not just a memory dispute. It's a live ammunition round in an active information war. And if you think more people need to understand that history is not just the past, but a weapon being used right now, then do me a favor, drop a comment. Tell me if you knew about Volhynia before this video. Tell me if this changed how you see the Polish-Ukrainian alliance. Comments tell the algorithm this video is generating conversation, and conversation is what pushes it into recommended feeds. Every comment counts. All right, let's talk about the bones. Here's the thing that makes this story more than geopolitics. In Volhynia, the dead were never properly buried. The massacres of 1943 to 1945 left tens of thousands of Polish victims in unmarked mass graves across what is now western Ukraine. The Polish Institute of National Remembrance estimated in 2022 that the remains of roughly 55,000 ethnic Polish victims and 10,000 Jewish ones still lie in death pits, waiting to be found, exhumed, and given dignified burials. For decades, this was a bureaucratic impossibility. From 2017 to 2024, Ukraine maintained a moratorium on all searches and exhumations of Polish victims, a retaliatory measure after Poland dismantled a UPA monument on Polish soil. The dead stayed in the ground, the families stayed without closure, and the diplomatic wounds stayed open. Then the full-scale invasion changed the calculus. In January 2025, Poland's Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, announced a breakthrough. Ukraine had agreed to resume exhumations. In April 2025, joint Polish-Ukrainian archaeological teams began work in the former village of Puzhniki in the Ternopil region. From April 24th to May 5th, they excavated a burial pit and found the remains of at least 42 people, 32 adults and 10 children. 7 of the adults had bullet marks. They found 4 pistol bullets, 4 rifle bullets, and a cartridge case from an Austrian Mannlicher rifle. Among the personal belongings, rosary beads, 4 Catholic medallions, 1 Orthodox medallion with the image of the Pochive Mother of God, 3 pairs of earrings, buttons, and the remains of shoes. The Polish side took DNA samples. The remains were reburied in September 2025 in a ceremony attended by both the Polish and Ukrainian culture ministers. It was a breakthrough, tiny in scale, 42 people out of 55,000, but symbolically enormous. Ukraine granted further permissions throughout the rest of 2025 and into 2026. In October 2025, exhumations were authorized in the former village of Ugwy. In December, 3 more locations. And in February 2026, just weeks before this video, Ukraine approved searches at Huta Pieniaka, a former village where, in February 1944, Ukrainian members of the Nazi Waffen-SS together with a UPA unit killed approximately 850 people. Right now, in the spring of 2026, these searches are underway or being prepared. Polish archaeologists and Ukrainian counterparts working side by side in muddy fields in western Ukraine, carefully uncovering bones that have been in the ground for over 80 years, cataloguing bullets and rosaries and children's shoes. Meanwhile, Poland has 13 pending applications for search and exhumation work in Ukraine. Ukraine has its own application to exhume UPA soldiers buried on Polish territory, with the first Ukrainian expedition to the village of Yurchkovo in the Przemysl district having launched in late 2025. So it's reciprocal. Both sides are digging up their dead on each other's soil. That's the architecture of reconciliation, brick by brick. But the political tension hasn't dissolved, not even close. And that brings us to right now. President Nawrocki, even after meeting Zelensky in Warsaw in December 2025, a meeting both sides described as positive, with Zelensky promising not declarations but concrete actions, continued to press for more. He wanted full-scale exhumations, not just selected sites. He wanted a Ukrainian acknowledgement that the massacres constituted genocide. In February 2026, Poland's Institute of National Remembrance publicly condemned the head of Ukraine's equivalent institution, after he described the Volhynia massacres as merely a local historical episode in Ukrainian memory, and questioned the genocide classification. So the situation right now, March 2026, is this. Both countries are simultaneously cooperating on exhumations and fighting over what to call what the exhumations are uncovering. They are digging up the same bones and interpreting them through entirely different national narratives. Poland says this was genocide. Ukraine says this was a tragedy born of a complex conflict, and the UPA fought for Ukrainian freedom. Poland says you cannot build a nation on the cult of a mass murderers organization. Ukraine says you cannot ask us to demolish our national heroes while Russia is trying to demolish our country. And both of them, on some level, are right. And both of them, on some level, are wrong. And that's what makes Volhynia so dangerous. Because unlike most historical disputes, this one has active consequences. Poland has veto power over Ukraine's EU accession. Every single EU member state must agree for a new country to join. Poland doesn't need to convince anyone. It just needs to say no. An 83-year-old massacre, a naming dispute over the word genocide, and the entire future of European security, potentially hanging on whether two nations can agree on a vocabulary for their shared dead. Now let me be real with you for a second. I spent weeks researching this video. Polish sources, Ukrainian sources, academic papers, primary documents, news from this month. This is the most complex, most sensitive, most politically charged video this channel has ever produced. If you've made it this far and you're still watching, that tells me something about you. It tells me you're the kind of person who doesn't want the simplified version. You want the full picture, even when the full picture is uncomfortable. That is exactly who this channel is for. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. I mean it. Hit subscribe right now, because the follow-ups to this video are already in development. The self-defense colonies of Przebrzeże, the Bandera question in full, Operation Vistula, and they are going to go just as deep. I want to end with something that sits outside the politics. The archaeologist who led the exhumation at Puzhniki, Alina Karlamova, described how the bones were arranged in the pit. The bodies had been brought in stages on carts and buried in homemade coffins or wooden boxes. When the pit became full, the villagers, whoever was left to do the burying, added supporting walls and packed the remains in tightly. Some bodies faced one direction, some the opposite, squeezed in wherever they would fit. Among those 42 sets of remains, they found one Orthodox medallion, an image of the Pochaev Mother of God. The Pochaev Lavra is one of the most sacred sites in Ukrainian Orthodoxy. That medallion was in a Polish grave. Maybe it belonged to a Ukrainian who married into a Polish family. Maybe it was a keepsake from a Ukrainian friend. We don't know. We'll never know. But it tells you something about who actually lived in Volhynia before the killing started. Not two neatly separated nations glaring at each other across a border. People, mixed up, intermarried, praying to different versions of the same God. The men who swung the axes on Bloody Sunday were not strangers. They were neighbors. They knew the names of the children they killed. That is what makes Volhynia different from a battlefield. This was intimate violence, community-level annihilation. And in 2026, 83 years later, the children of those communities, one nation fighting for survival against Russia, the other trying to be its most important ally while demanding an accounting for the dead, are still trying to figure out how to be in the same room together. The exhumations are the answer. Not because they resolve the language debate, genocide versus tragedy, but because they operate on a level beneath the language. They say these people existed. They died here. We will name them. We will bury them with dignity. That is something both sides can do without agreeing on a word. If you think stories like this, the history underneath the headlines, the 83-year-old events that shape tomorrow's alliance, deserve to be told on this platform, then subscribe. I'm going to keep making these. This story has enough material for a whole series, and I genuinely want to hear from you which direction to go next. Drop a comment. The self-defense colonies, Przebrzeże, Huta Stepanska, the Polish civilians who built fortresses out of farmhouses and held off thousands. The Bandera question, how one man became simultaneously a national hero and a symbol of genocide. Operation Vistula, when Poland deported 150,000 Ukrainians in retaliation. Tell me what you want next. The best ideas for this channel have always come straight from the comments. Thank you for watching. I'm Ivo Vichev, and I hope the people in the pit at Puzhniki, with their rosaries and their earrings and their one Orthodox medallion, finally have some peace. See you next time.